when I asked Bernadette McAliskey for some biographical details for the conference programme, she gave me the following description, quote, "A lifetime social activist and human rights campaigner, an internationalist, a socialist, a feminist, and Republican, acknowledging the tensions of the intersections between these labels." This is an accurate description, but it is also to hide her light on the rebushal. Thinking of this evening and looking for inspiration as to how I might introduce her, I reread the book she wrote in 1969 at the age of 21. She refused to call the book an autobiography. It was, she said, an attempt to explain how, quote, "the complex of economic, social and political problems of Northern Ireland threw up the phenomena of Bernadette Devlin as she was then known." And she was a phenomenon. When she wrote the book, she was already MP for Mid-Ulster at Westminster, and more importantly, she was a leading light in a civil rights movement which was to bring down a corrupt unionist regime that had held power for more than 50 years. So the book wasn't an autobiography. She wanted to tell the story of the civil rights movement and how she became involved in it. The book is called The Price of My Soul, and the title is significant and salutary, not least for those of us who are academics. She took the title from her mother, and what it refers to is, quote, "not the price for which I would be prepared to sell out, but rather the price we all must pay in life to preserve our own integrity." That price can be very high, and Bernadette McAliskey has paid it. Reading the book with hindsight, what is remarkable is how resolutely and wonderfully anti-sectarian she and other leaders of the civil rights movement were. It is remarkable because when eventually, belatedly, the demands of the civil rights movement begin to be addressed by government, they are addressed on the basis of the very categories, the very communal categories of Catholic and Protestant that Bernadette McAliskey and her comrades had sought to deconstruct. At the conference tomorrow, we will consider the argument that to tackle a sectarian or racist system, one has no alternative but to use the very categories created by that system. Sartre called this anti-racist racism. Against this, there is the Caribbean-American feminist Audre Lorde, who famously said, quote, "The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. They may allow us to temporarily beat him at his own game, but they will never enable us to bring about genuine social change." Ireland doesn't fit into this debate in any straightforward way, but it is clear that in Northern Ireland, the two communities model of governance is making it more difficult to tackle racism and sectarianism. Certainly, that is increasingly the view of the Northern Ireland Council for Ethnic Minorities. And symptomatic of these difficulties are the recent comments on Muslims by the First Minister of Northern Ireland. But of course, the difficulties of tackling institutional racism and sectarianism are not peculiar to Ireland, north or south. And the papers at the conference tomorrow range from Ireland to Israel, Palestine, to Iraq and Rwanda. For the moment, though, we are very, very lucky to have Bernadette McAliskey to address these and other issues. It's my sense that she has remained true to the vision of the civil rights movement that she spelled out in The Price of My Soul. She now works with migrants as part of the South Tyrone Empowerment Programme, and she remains resolutely anti-racist and anti-sectarian. Her talk is entitled The Legacy of Hierarchy, Christianity and Colonisation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I am going to remain seated because I very recently got a new knee, and I will not, for my final run around, be scoring goals for Uruguay for quite some time. I'm just unable to give this lecture standing up, and that's my excuse. I prefer to sit when I'm talking anyway. When Andrew asked me if I was interested in doing this, I was interested for two reasons. One, the nature of the MPhil course itself, and two, because of my own specific interest in adult learning and in people having the opportunity quite often as mature students to return and contribute the experiential expertise of life to the academic route of learning, which is a very rich way of doing it. Personally, I don't think young people should be allowed into universities because they don't know anything. That's very ageist, but what I actually mean is that sometimes when we come in to the academic route of learning, we are looking at wonderful ideas in the abstract, and it's only when we get out into the less protected world that we truly begin to bring experience and intellect and practice and theory together and try and figure out our way through the world. The other thing that really interests me, as you may have guessed, is words. I love them. I like the sound of them, I like using them, and I'm fascinated by language and the way we use it, and how we register the way in which we speak about things, depending on the context in which we are. A very simple example of that is you can be talking to an ordinary person on the street, and they talk like ordinary people. But along comes a man from RTE, or a woman from RTE, and they stick a microphone under their nose. And people who were up to that point walking down the street, minding their own business, begin to perambulate and start using big words. And the whole thing just gets very convoluted. So when Andrew asked me if I'd like to speak on this issue, and if I could give him a title for what I was going to say, I said, well, I'll give you two titles and you can determine which actually is more appropriate for the audience. So I gave him this one here, which is The Legacy of Christianity, Colonisation and Hierarchy, or the other way around. Or I said, if you want the conversation pitched in a different way, you can title this lecture, Is It Me or Is This Room Full of Elephants? It's the same speech, it's merely the register that's different. So we opted for this here because I don't think that strategic, whatever you were talking about, would pay for a speech on Is This Room Full of Elephants? So what I wanted to look at was looking at the title of the conference, which was very interesting, Power, Ethnicity and Conflict. And I wanted to take a look at each of those words first. The word that it interests me very much is the word conflict, and how we are conditioned to be frightened of it. We absolutely, we are trained almost from the cradle to fear conflict. It is seen in a very negative way. In the North we talk about the conflict. We talk about the conflict in the Middle East, and it conjures up in our minds violent altercations and violent exchanges between the powerful and the non-powerful, violent interactions between people of opposing points of views. But whatever we do, we want to resolve conflict. We want to avoid conflict. And yet if we look at conflict in another way, conflict is about tension. It's about those spaces where certainty meets opposing certainties. And it's in that conflicted space where certainties become tested that creativity begins. And so conflict is actually, tension and conflict and friction are where creativity comes from. It's where ideas come from. It's where new development comes from. And in a very simple way, if we look at evolution, it's where pearls come from. No friction in the oyster shell, no pearl. That's just the reality. So it's interesting to understand why are we, where does this fear of conflict come from? Where does the fear of conflicting ideas, where does the fear of uncertainty come from? Why do we not want to be the person who's walking in a different direction? What's the context around that? And it's important to think of that, how we are all conditioned to do what we're told. And that's a very, very long history. It's not just our current education system or education system over years. It's not just in this country. It's very, very deep within us not to step out of line. And the reason we know not to do it is because of the word at the beginning of the conference, the question of power. And every time we have conversations about inequality, we have conversations about conflict, we have conversations about integration, we have conversations about good relations, poverty, banks. The question that we never actually want to talk about, the thing we never really want to look at, is power. So when we look at conflict here and why we're afraid of it, part of the reason we are conditioned to be afraid of conflict is that deeply ingrained in our psyche is a clear understanding, an anthropological, an historical, a socially learned understanding of the consequences that are to be paid for being the person who is in conflict with the given idea. We look back to some of the great classical scholars. We look back to some of the great classical painters. In their lifetime, they were considered lunatics. It's only many years later that we begin to catch up with the individual idea. So most people know, they know it in their bones, they know it in their everyday life, that there is nothing good comes to the powerless of challenging the powerful. That's the learned lesson. And so if we ask ourselves then, what is power? What is power itself? How come people get categorized into those who have power, whatever it is, and those who don't? And there's a number of interesting theories about how that came about. If you go down the scientific route, I believe there are people who must own this building. If you go down the science route, people tell you that power is a source. Power just doesn't come from nowhere. Power has an originating point. Most of our heat, light and energy, our power source is the sun. And if you go down the sociology, social science route, and remember Thomas Paine, he will tell you the same thing. He'll tell you all power has a source. And so power and the exercise of power either comes from the exercise of might. Might, that's what it is. It's the ability to enforce. It's that kind of power. It's the ability to prevent and to exercise a greater force than that which is pushing against you. And if you have that kind of power, then you do what you do because there is nobody to stop you doing it. And that's a very primitive kind of power. And if we come to looking at the development and the beginning of the Age of Enlightenment and questions around the development of democratic principles and constitutionalism, and look at people like Thomas Paine and others, they begin to look at this position of power. And Paine says something that is now very calm and moderate and middle of the road, but was revolutionary in his time to the point where he had to flee the country to save his life. He said that all power, all authority that is exercised over the individual human being must in some way be derived and delegated from that human being to the person who holds power. Because I am a human being. First and foremost, I am accountable to and for myself. That's the basic tenet of republicanism. That I as a person have an integrity of my own. I am first and foremost accountable to myself and for myself in this world. I can't live on my own. And so I make my social contracts, I make my social bonds with my kin, with my family, with my neighbours. And in beginning to work collectively, I trade some of my individual freedoms for collective freedoms and benefits, so that I can live at peace and harmony and security in a collective. That principle applies whether you're talking to a small group in a very simple format of community, or whether you're talking about a large nation. The rule still applies. That whoever is exercising power must be able to demonstrate the source of their power back to me. Otherwise it is, and I learned this word when I was 9, otherwise it is a usurpation of my right. That's what it is, a usurpation of my right to self-determine my existence. And Paine said that neither time, good intent, nor benevolence allows that usurpation to become anything other than a usurpation. It is an abuse of my individual humanity for power to be exercised over me without my consent. And that idea of individual conscience, individual right, developed into constitutionalism and allowing people, individual human people, to determine for themselves the principles through which they would coexist, the mechanisms by which they would regulate their own behaviour. And as Paine also said, people then formed a government because collectively they had to police themselves and ensure that society and the individuals within it maintained the principles, maintained the rules that they developed themselves for good government. And so the existence of government is a recognition or a recognition of the weakness within ourselves. There's an interesting question to be asked. How did a genius like Paine, common man, people like him working through these big ideas, at the time he did, how did he miss the bit about women? How did he miss it? Here was Thomas Paine figuring it all out for the rights of man. How did he miss the women? It wasn't that Mary Wollstonecraft wasn't at his ear, saying, yeah, what about women? How did he, in the context of developing the ideas of constitutional democracy, which became the bedrock of broad Republican constitutional democratic ideology, how did he, in the context of America, not see the native population? How did he miss them when he was developing these ideas? So when we're looking here at conflict, when we're looking at power, and when we're looking at ethnicity, we're looking at a triangulation, if you like, of development in which these ideas begin to form. And there's a very simple reason why they missed it. Because just as we are today just as we are today, afraid to speak out. I mean, here, on this side of the border, never mind the other, you people have been robbed, blind. The wealth of your nation has been stolen from you by crooks. Very, very powerful crooks. And very, very timid. I wouldn't necessarily say cowardly, but very, very timid people to whom you entrusted the government of the country. We're so afraid of them that instead of protecting you from those who stole your wealth, they made you put back the money in the kitty that the robbers had stolen. And what did you do? What you were told. What you were told. It takes a lot of conditioning. It takes a lot of fear. It takes a lot of control to get people to do that. So how do we get ourselves into that position? Like this. Let me tell you about the legacy of Christianity, hierarchy, and colonisation. Because the sorry state that we are in today is a direct result of all of these. When I was young, which is longer ago than most of you, but the mantra hasn't changed. I was taught the answer to a number of questions, and you're all students and intellectuals, some of you Gramsci's intellectuals, but here's a big intellectual question. Who made the world? God made the world. How do we know God made the world? God told us He made the world. And God's word is true. That's the end of that. God made the world. We know God made the world because God told us He made the world. And God doesn't tell lies. We add to that. My father used to tell me, he died when I was 9, but when I was a child, my father used to say, while we were learning the catechism, who made the world, God made the world, my father in the corner used to say, my dad made the world, and I carried the bricks. Quite subversive to teach. Did God make the world? But which God made the world? Whose God made the world? Certainly not Allah or Muhammad, who is his prophet. Oh no. If you were north of the border at the minute, it's not racism to stand in the preacher's corner and to say Islam is a religion spawned in hell. That's freedom of expression. You can stand in the church on a Sunday and say that Muslims are infidels. And it's not racism. It is the teaching of the church. If you're a fundamental, born-again, anti-Islamic, racist. But you can say it. Because we know that God is white. Of course He is. Everybody knows that the real God is white. Everybody knows that the real God is Western European. And everybody knows that the real God invented capitalism, imperialism, and that is why we say for God and Ulster, for God and the Queen, for God and the country, because our God, He made the world. White, English speaking, Christian, Now, how did we learn that catechism? Because we did learn that catechism. That is the history, that's what we learned. There are variations on it, you know. I tell you what we don't learn in history. We don't learn that this bizarre group of people who robbed and stole the common lands of Europe and decided that not only did God make the world, but God somehow or another came to them in the middle of the night in a fashion not maybe unlike the visit of the Holy Spirit to the Blessed Virgin. But God, anyway, God decided who would be the king of England. God decides that too. That family there, God chose them to be the kings and queens of England. And God chose them to be the kings and queens of Spain. And God chose some of us to be poor and other people to own everything. And my mother used to tell me that when we all die and get to heaven, God will explain to us why the rich should, the wicked should prosper and the good should suffer in this world. And when we get to the next world, God will put it all right. Thank you, God. At about the age of 19, I kind of got tired waiting, because I thought I could live a very long time down here. And God said, keep turning the other cheek, and I only had to. Turn this one, and said, you know what, I also have elbows. I've had enough of this cheek turning, pie in the sky stuff. But I find it very interesting, because then when I got involved in civil rights movement, I got sent off to America, a whole new world, beyond the shores of Ireland, and a brilliant education on the hustings and streets of America. And so there's a new history I'd like to put to you. God didn't make the world. And God didn't make us. We made God in our own image and likeness. As an excuse. As a moral cushion for all the things we do. So when we look at power, and when we're looking at ethnicity now, we have to look at historically, how did we get to where we are? How did we come to a position that whether we are in the mainstream, regardless of what colour we are, regardless of what ethnic background, national background we come from, that there is a general consensus among the not so well informed of the pecking order. There's God first, there's human beings next, and this used to be a scientific categorization some many years back, the age of enlightenment. Then there was the animals, and then there maybe was all these other people here, maybe infidels were down here. But within the ranking of human beings, people began to be ranked. They weren't always ranked on the basis of the colour of their skin or the countries from which they came. If you go back sometimes into Greek and Roman history long ago, sometimes races were determined by the latitude in which they lived. When you go back to some of the Greek and Roman scholars, they put forward a very good thesis that where the land was good and prosperous, the people were peaceful, but really not up to much. Well, because they had no hardship. But the further north you went and the colder it got, and the harder and stonier the ground got, the people got more warlike, but also resilient. And when they got to the latitude where we live, they said it was really the real hardship here that made us all barbarians. So there was actually an ideology once that said the nearer you live to the equator, the more civilized you can afford to be. And the nearer you get to the poles, well, you kind of revert down the lower scale to basic survival. So how do we get to a point where it's white man first, and then there are the dependents and chattels like women and children and people with disability, who still kind of come in here above than people of colour and people of other countries? Is it because we are smarter? No, maybe the climate made us smarter. I don't think so. Let me tell you how it happened. It happened because the heads of states of Europe, when they were finished fighting amongst themselves and set around national boundaries that allowed them to build their own wealth and power and exercise their autocratic usurpation of people's rights against the people in their own countries, they developed a strength and capacity and got into their little boats, and they set off and they raped and plundered and enslaved continent after continent. They enslaved the people of Africa. People who had their own social norms, languages, social structures, nations, with brute force and the power of might. The powerful heads of Europe stole, plundered, and raped the Southern Hemisphere. They took silver out of South America and they built the Industrial Revolution. They took human beings out of Africa and they treated them as slaves and chattels. What did their God think of that? Well, their God thought that was a good thing, because what in their minds they did was they civilized infidels. They brought culture to people who had none. They brought the gift of the English language to people who were making strange noises. What kind of jumped up parochial arrogance got away with that? Because it had behind it the power of might, the power of terror, the power of military force, and the weapon of moral superiority that God was in his heaven and they were doing his work. So is it any wonder that Pastor McConnell can stand in the 21st century and repeat in his tiny little mind, aloud for all to hear, doctrine that allowed those things to happen? And if we've never challenged that history, if we've never challenged a history of patriarchy, of hierarchy that says white is first, every day, new languages are lost. Minority languages across the world lost. Who needs them? Because the languages of power are English, French, German, Spanish. And the poor Americans think that is a language. That's English for people who can't spell. But these power languages, are they just by coincidence the languages of the crowned heads of Europe? Of Western European capitalism? Fueled by the adaptation of a religious belief to an institutional moral excuse for theft, terror, murder of the rights of the people of the universe. If I were to get teaching that down P3 in the Holy Cross, if children understood that, would they have a different perspective on the person they meet on the streets of Dublin who has a different colour to themselves, who speaks with a different accent to themselves? But unchallenged and deeply ingrained in the legacy of Christianity and the legacy of hierarchy, of capitalism, imperialism, is not simply an historic colonisation of other countries, but the colonisation of the minds and the morals of all of us. And until we begin intellectually to challenge that, we are left trying to dismantle the master's house with the master's tools. But we have to start. We have to start where we are, which is with the only tools that we've got. We have to understand what these categories and issues are so that we can begin to deconstruct them. However, if we continue to get stuck in that narrative, the end consequence of maintaining the ethnic narrative to its logical conclusion is apartheid, separate but equal. Because when we look at the history of the injustice, we have to start to put it right. So one, we need what you call the anti-racist racism, through which we can understand it. But in order to end it, we need a new methodology. And that has to take us right back then to taking forward the core principles that, for all their limitations, people like Paine and Wollstonecraft embodied. There is only one race, the human race. And every individual member of that race has an individual integrity by virtue of their existence. It is their inherent and inalienable right. And people don't have to earn their rights. Their rights come with the fact that the person exists. People don't have to behave well to have rights. It's easier if they do. But rights are not a trade-off for good behaviour. In fact, sometimes the people who are most vulnerable to the violation of their rights are the badly behaved. But unless we begin to put together a new way of thinking that understands that every human being has equal human rights, and that the responsibility of every other human being is to protect the rights of their fellow human beings and their sister human beings. When we start to think like that, we can begin to challenge this legacy. Because it is here that we begin to see, well, how then do some people be further from this table, the enjoyment of their rights, than others? How come people are further from the table? It is in understanding this legacy that we see how people get pushed further and further away. So while we have got to use and understand the categorizations, whether that is ethnicity, whether it is gender, whether it is class, into which hierarchies have pushed us, we have got to find new tools to eradicate it. And they're not new tools either. They are the tools of solidarity. They are the tools of democracy. Simple rule of democracy is there are more of us. There are more human beings who fundamentally believe in humanity than there are powerful people who believe simply in money. And if they're not, we're done for. We're done for. Might as well accept it. If humanity, individually and collectively, has lost the will to protect each other, to extend the solidarity of humanity to all human beings, then the human race is doomed. You might as well get on with the bed now. Because the survival of this species and the survival of this planet is that we begin to find a new conversation that challenges the history and legacy that has brought us here. I have absolutely no idea whether God made the world or not. I have no idea which God made the world. I suspect no God made the world, but I have no time to waste on that abstract argument. None. If I die and find out that he's up there, I take my chances. But I'm not expecting to hear a trumpet. But what I do have to do, and what we all have to do, is recognize that in the here and now, unless we name racism, unless we name human rights violations, unless we name violations on the basis of gender, unless we challenge the accepted inhumanity from the powerful, institutionalized, I'm not simply talking about people who behave badly as individuals, unless we accept that historically our societies are structured to protect power, to stifle critical, independent, dissident thinking, to eradicate tension, conflict, and opposition, then we will always be stuck with the fear of the other. And we will forget that the responsibility in this room, and the responsibility in this country, because that's where we are, lies with us, because no matter how far down our own pecking order we are, by virtue of the fact that we are white, and we are English speaking, and we are located here, if we are not part of the challenge against that racism, we are the privileged rump who are benefiting from it. Take your pick, whichever side you want to be on. When your thesis is written, you'd want to be on the picket line, or else you're done for. Thank you very much.
I love that ability to bring it to
it always comes back to the picket line.
a specific kind of set of tasks or program, or I think it's wonderful, and the clarity of that as well. We have some time for questions. Yeah. So I think we also have a roving mic. David has got that. So we have a question up there. If you'd like to say your name and whatever else you want to say about yourself.
Just first of all, I'd like to say it's an absolutely fantastic evening to be in the presence of Bernadette McAliskey. I have a very happy memory of my father stopping the car to listen to your maiden speech in the House of Commons, and it was just something I will remember for the rest of my life. My question is even in the Constitution, or in a declaration like ours, the Irish Proclamation, which referred to Irish men and Irish women in the name of God and of the dead generations, we got it terribly wrong. There's a scathing letter in the Irish Independent today saying, what are we about to celebrate in 1916? We allowed, back to the Christianity thing, a Catholic church which we all, a lot of us were brought up in. I don't have any personal angst with it, but undoubtedly the handing over of institutions of the state to the power of, well, not entirely Catholicism, because we've had Protestant ones as well that have also shown to have behaved less than well. So what is it about human beings that they don't, as you say, trust their own beliefs in a set of individual values that we have to have enshrined in sets of shared values? Whereas over here, why can't we let live and let live how people want to lead their lives? And that should be the prime thing rather than a sense of order. Why do we need to have somebody to speak down to us, support us? Why do we need this hierarchy?
I think that's a very good question. The issue of having hierarchies is an issue of control and stifling, which is what I'm saying. In terms of the Constitution, I think at least here you have a Constitution and you have a capacity, a mechanism. People don't use it. You have a mechanism to demand a constitutional conference and a change of that Constitution. And there have been some changes in the Constitution, not all for the good. But, people have got to start taking responsibilities individually and collectively for not accepting what happens and for using and developing the mechanisms, the democratic mechanisms, and there are many of them there from United Nations charters, from international obligations, down to your right to change your constitution. And I think we need to be getting on with it. I think if God made the world, so I come back to it, he should be fit, and it's usually he should be fit to mind everybody's morals without using the state as a tool. So he should stay in his chapels and churches and do his own business without the middleman, and let the business of government be secular and based on and based on belonging and citizenship and residence and protection of the people who find themselves, for whatever period of time, within the boundaries and protection of that state. And then the church should be in the church saying its prayers and minding its own business. And then we'll all see, whenever push comes to shove, if there'll be a day of judgment, this side or the other side of whatever.
Back round the back, Rosalie.
Hello, Bernadette. And I want to add one more. And however, my own, I grew up on the border and we moved to Trinity, and racism was very much alive in the 70s. And I'm quite surprised that, first of all, Congress are never named in the Northern conflict. We were there, we were used and abused by both sides and by both states. Also, I'm really interested in your opinion on Utah, where rights are not a trade-off for good behavior. Yes, the Irish state considers proper existing and not being worthy of a place on the statute books, but we haven't earned that right. We don't behave well. And I just wondered, would you have a comment
On travellers.
on anything?
The first was racism, the travellers' position in the border regions in the conflict of the Second World failure of Irish people recognition?
I think one of the things that has to be said, if this country was to be judged on anything, its treatment of the traveller population of Ireland should have the entire country before the International Human Rights Court of The Hague. Not a doubt about that. Not a doubt that deeply ingrained prejudice, and I see it in the course of my everyday work, and I work in terms of new migrant workers and new immigrants into the local area where I work. The settled minority ethnic population, which is maybe 1, 2, 3 generations, and the most significant, most deeply ingrained racism and day-to-day bullying, victimization, violence, humiliation of human beings is reserved for the traveller population. The isolation of travellers from the education system, you could go on forever, but it is an indication of the barbarity and the ignorance of our nation that we have the traveller communities and population of this country accepted, we accept the treatment from the bottom to the very top, and that position is put that the traveller population bring it on themselves. Why? Oh, you know all the lists of why. Oh, they don't wash as often as us. Would you wash every day if you were forced to live on the side of the road and there was no water? The trouble, the difficulty people have to get to the most basic services. And say, well, that's your own choice because you choose to be different. So I wholeheartedly agree with you, and a lot of my everyday work is around traveller rights. Just recently, actually, we won a reasonable battle against the Northern Ireland Housing Executive on, in the 21st century, on the right of the traveller community on the traveller site in Coal Island to have individual addresses and to have individual access to electricity. Now, they weren't people living on the side of the road. Travellers on the Glen Road site have lived on that site for 30 years. And yet, what was happening was that the Northern Ireland Housing Executive responsible for that site provided electricity to the whole site and arbitrarily divided the bill up amongst everybody who lived there. That's just what they did. They just said there's so much money going into that site, and they made up bills and sent them around and said, you have to pay that, you have to pay that. They said, but I don't use that electric. Well, you're all the same. You're all using it. Imagine if you went down Pierce Street and everybody who lived in a private house had to take a share of the Trinity Hotel's electric bill. Sure, you all live in Pierce Street. It's all the same thing. It's a disgrace, but I totally agree with you.
Bridget?
Bernadette McAliskey, I met you before. I'm a travel woman, and I'd like to say how inspirational your talk was. I'd just like to make reference. You spoke about the dehumanization of people and the people in Africa, their language being taken away from them. And as a traveller community, our language is not recognised, as we as people aren't recognised, and we're dehumanised. And just recently we had our new Minister for Justice go on national radio and completely debate the fact that we even had a language. So that's the situation for travellers at the moment. So I found it really fascinating that this happens globally and to know that we're not alone. So thank you.
And I think just in that point again, the point you raised before, in the north, which is one of the anomalies of the northern position, being on the island and being in the United Kingdom, the traveller population in the north of Ireland is a recognised categorisation within the racial equality legislation and recognised as a minority ethnic group with specific protection, which is in the northern part of the island. But here, that has not existed and has been resisted. I think, I'm not sure if very recently, I know the campaign to have the traveller population clearly designated raises the question that you raised earlier about pragmatically you have to get that categorisation in order to begin to get the debate around the protection and the challenging of the violation of rights. It's almost like the naming and shaming of these specific violations.
We have a question here. Sorry, David, it's quite a...
Don't worry, I think she will hear me.
Okay.
Please, I would like to know what your opinion is in relation to the part played by Irish missionaries on the issue of colonialism. Always, here in Ireland, we hear Irish people were not part of colonial masters. But then we have religion. I don't think that British colonial system would have worked anyway, especially in Africa. Thank you.
I think again, if we're talking from what was my history, all the good people went out and they educated all the poor little black children. And we all gathered up pennies and we sent them all to the black babies. And there's a level at which you say, at a humanitarian level, you say, that is generosity and solidarity that in modern ways one might see through concern, through trócaire. But given the context in which it was developed for us, it also taught us, do you know what we were? We were up here helping them poor people down here. And what made us better than them? Not because our governments went to their country and stole all that belonged to them and enslaved them, but we were good Catholics and Christians, and it was the generosity of our mother church that went out and taught the people. There is an argument that says, you're doing all right. What was it we taught you? If we hadn't, if Western Europe had not stolen and invaded and enslaved the people of Africa in order to build its own wealth, what need did you have to have the bizarre religion of a small island off the west coast of Europe transported to Africa? God would have found his own road there. And there were people there who had their own faith systems, who had their own education systems. Had Africa evolved had Africa evolved without the incredible cruelty that was visited upon that continent, the idea of sending holy priests out to Africa so they wouldn't pollute the local population with radicalism would never have arisen. So I'm not saying that there wasn't some good benefit, that comes from that. But what I am saying is the legacy that makes the history that is created, that tells the narrative in that way, that here we were and here was poor Africa, and what would you have done without us? Thrived, developed, built your own democracy, and maybe have come across in boats and civilized Europe. Who knows?
Sorry, there's just one more.
And I think that the current wave of south to north migration is probably going to be our salvation, and you may yet, through your endeavours, civilize this country.
Dermot Brannock. Bernadette, you remind us that racism isn't just about colour, talking about the Greeks and the latitude. People here in the audience have reminded us with regard to the travellers, and you yourself have commented on it. It's also a fact that the Irish experienced racism as a race, as a people, as a culture. They experienced it in Britain and they experienced it from the colonisation here. In our own language, we have an expression, beyond pale. Beyond pale is barbarism. Beyond pale is what you don't want to know, which is horrible stuff. Beyond pale is outside Dublin. Outside Dublin when it was occupied by the Norman English. And that's still in our language today, which shows what a powerful ideology it was. That continued in England, and it took different forms. It continued in Ireland. It took the form of trying to make the Irish like the English, or trying to make them have their religion, or it took the form of trying to eliminate them or replace them. And that's the legacy of all that is still with us today. One of the reasons I think why the Church, the Catholic Church in particular in Ireland, gained the power it has, is because for a time it too was hunted alongside the rest of us. And so we identified with it, and we protected them, and they seemed like they were of us. Unfortunately, when they came to power, they showed something different. And it's important for us to recognise that this is not something that's just in the past. We seem to think like that now, because we're all grown up now, and we've left all this superstition behind us, and we're modern thinking people. But the education system is still controlled by the Catholic Church, right today in this state. You cannot guarantee the church child will get into most schools in this state unless you toe the line, go to church, have your child baptised, attend the ceremonies, and prove that you're a good Catholic in those formal ritualistic ways. That's what we have here today. And so I think it's important for people to recognise that these conflicts that we think are past, like the one in the Six Counties where you come from, Bernadette, where people are still hunted for their political beliefs, that these things are struggles still to be fought for and fought against.
And just to add that, because the overwhelming church here is the Catholic Church, it's not simply the Catholic Church. I'm taking that in that broader Christian philosophy. You know, people talk about, oh, you go to them Muslim countries, and it's interesting that deep fear of Islam. You know, people don't know what it is, but they know you don't want it around here. Why not? Maybe because somewhere in the back of our minds it might be payback time for the Crusades. But because we see ourselves as that norm, there is not any conscious understanding that what we think is a secular democracy is internalized Christian norms, not necessarily secular humanist citizenship norms, but as they are filtered through a Christian church, whether that is Catholic, Church of England, Presbyterian, whatever these sects are, that it is filtered through that Christian narrative of that specific religion. You know, and the head of the Church of England is the head of state. So it's not a secular state. You know, we talk about Turkey being a Muslim country. England is a Christian country. So what's good for England should be good for Turkey. If we're going to have secular governments, let's have them. But let's not have Christian countries and Catholic countries sitting up saying, oh, we can't have Islamic countries. Why not?
We'll go to the back and then Renee.
Hi, Bernadette. I have just a very open question for you. What are your thoughts on the repetition of history in Irish society, particularly in terms of states of exception and the current status as asylum seekers, particularly in Mossley Centre? So we now see what I would feel is a repetition of what the Church has done in the past, institutionalising people and taking away their civil liberties. Thanks.
The question of asylum seekers here.
Just what's your thoughts on particularly the pattern of history repeating itself, despite the fact that we're supposed to live in a secular society, that you have states of exception in Mossley and in Will Street and Cork where people are detained without rights, until the state feels that they're able to become citizens or they're able to refugee status.
Within the treatment of asylum seekers. Well, I think again the whole issue of how we process those seeking refuge in the country is not very much difficult south of the border than it is north, and it is a punitive system. You know, people come to our shores seeking protection, and asylum seekers are a specific group of people. They are a group of people who are quite literally seeking protection from persecution, and they seek protection on our shores. And once they get here, the treatment is punitive, and people are effectively criminalized for being victims until we determine what. Are they worthy enough to be let in? Can we assimilate the victim into some kind of useful commodity for the state? Or is it until we find a space for them? Before the famine, there were an awful lot of people here, and we haven't even caught up with the statistics yet. So, you know, we have room. I don't want you all to panic. But we have room for about another 2 million people on this island. We have room for another 2 million people on this island. So I have bad news for you. We're either going to have to breed an awful lot of people to fill the space, or we'd better just say, look, we would benefit as a country from more people, a greater diversity, greater cultural diversity, greater intellectual diversity, a greater entrepreneurial, a greater human diversity. We should have signs up so that they can be seen as the planes go by. Don't pass here, we need you. There's room for 2 million more. If we haven't a government that can keep them, let's get a new government. But there's room for 2 million more on this island.
Really?
Yes, thank you very much for a very interesting lecture which inspires rather than tells us things we didn't know. But I'd just like to ask whether Christianity is the unit of analysis. I would say perhaps religion. Yeah. I am Israeli, Jewish. They do very well with colonization and on oppression and so on and so forth. So maybe the category would have been race, hierarchy, race and colonization. But the question I specifically want to ask you is about the awful racism we witnessed recently in Northern Ireland, where the kind of a myth of the two communities is a myth. And would you agree with Bobby McVeigh's analysis that in fact it is the racism in Northern Ireland is a loyalist racism, which is the way he's an analyzing. So I'm pretty disturbed by the fact that after the so-called peace, we have race, but race was always there, and sectarianism in a way is racist or racial categorization. That's my reading of it. So I'm interested to pragmatically and more specifically hear about your opinion about it.
Yeah, well, I agree with you in terms of, it's not just Christianity.
And Islam as well, by the way.
And it's not, yes, because I could do this if the majority of the audience to whom I were speaking were members of Islam, I might concentrate on Islam. But for the focus of this context and this place and the racism in this country, the religious driver in this country is Christianity. If you were talking about the state of Israel and the conflict in the Middle East, you might look at the same thing and you would look at the issues around, again, the use of individual faith. I don't mind people being Catholics or Protestants or Muslims or anything else. That's their own private worship business. It's turning this into an institutional mechanism of governing everybody else's life as well. In the context of the North, I think that's, it's a difficult question, because it is not as simple as saying, I think sectarian and racism are aspects of the same disease. I don't think that they're two different things, and that racism is the new sectarianism, as they say. I think that the overt, crude racism on the street, it might be more visible in loyalist communities, and there are historic, again, reasons and understandings of how that might be the case. But I think it is not true to say, I think it is a myth to say, that racism in Northern Ireland is essentially a loyalist phenomenon. The crude vulgarity may be more prevalent, and the capacity to be racist in a more sophisticated fashion is learned behaviour within an increasingly confident Catholic population. If you talk about the racism against travellers, which is the oldest racism that we see, it is not any more different within one community than the other, and might be considered to be more a Catholic phenomenon, because the traveller population is more likely to be located in Catholic areas. But the thing that worries me most in terms of Northern Ireland and anywhere else is that if we simply concentrate the fight against racism on the brute force of this conflict that we're afraid of, the violent, vulgar face of graffiti on the wall, the broken window, which should be challenged every day, what is grinding people down every day is the institutional racism that allows you, and the things that we have seen in our work, is that if you have legitimate claims for housing or benefits or access to a doctor or complaints, and they're coming in, especially in the north of Ireland, because we know this. If it's Murphy, could be Catholic, could be Protestant, but probably Catholic. If it's Polowensky, it's a foreigner down to the bottom of the pipe. Who sees that? Who sees the outsider pushed to the bottom? If it's, if it's the person who goes to the police and makes a complaint, and the police say we're open-minded on whether it could be racist or not. We're looking at a case where a young Nigerian man was allocated a house. He went to go to the house. There were everything, people with banners and people with chairs sitting out, picketing, preventing him to get into their house. And he said, no, it's not racist. Man from Nigeria isn't allowed into the house, but it's not racist. Why did he not want him into the house? He's not local. It's not about racism, it's about localism. He's not one of us, his grandparents don't live in this street. We need this local house for local area. And so when you have organs of the state that are prepared to never mind Pastor McConnell, but when you have the First Minister, my eyes just go funny every time I have to think of it. When you have the First Minister of the state saying the pastor is entitled to preach the gospel as he sees it, given what the man said, and so he's not going to interfere with that. And then when confronted himself with what is because he attends that church, he's a member of that congregation, what is your position? For him, in the context of what I'm saying, in the legacy of imperialism and racism and white domination, for the First Minister of Northern Ireland to say, well, I would trust Muslims for some things, like going to the shop and bringing back the right change. That's what he said. In his position as the head of a let-on banana state in Northern Ireland. Now, there are a number of things like that. Oh, he should have been asked, well, okay, what else? Picking cotton? Shining shoes? You know, that was the unspoken insult to people. You could send them to the shop and they'd bring back the change. Now, given the person I am, I would like to have asked him a question. Who is it you think would go to the shop and steal the change? Females. But it wasn't that. I don't think that was the racist message at the top. Then it's difficult to blame the isolated loyalist at the bottom. That's just what I think.
We've got one more question and then I think we'll begin to wind up.
I want to ask you, would you say trying to tackle state racism more complex and more difficult to tackle rather than dealing with, say, the kind of instances that we've had in Dublin and Belfast recently, like 4 or 5 guys go to Reframing and despite for the cost to come out, and by the way, they wouldn't even entertain taking a statement of the taxi driver in question, and then of course, you know, a 15-year-old young Protestant guy tackling state racism. Well, I mean, the state doesn't ever say, unlike the Osirian language that people of a wider background have to deal with in this country and the same in England, they usually come out, particularly in the media, what we call welfare tourists, robbing our jobs, blah, blah, blah. But they never use anything overtly, aggressively racist. They use such a term, they use very clever words, and they use the media who propagate. And going back to Peter Robson forgot, has a selective memory because I think he was involved in Invest NI that went over to some countries that actually have a Muslim Islam background, and I think in the north, they're trying to create new weaponry for the British Army and other countries that are trying to rebuild up, be like NATO. And I assume you probably don't assume he went over there and the people behind him, unarmed, the people that he said that he wouldn't trust. You know what I mean? But I think tackling state racism, because you'll never get a judge or a police officer that will say our state is racist because they're employed by the state. I mean, although there's a lot of topic here, the whitewash of the report into the bugging of Garda ombudsman, the government, the state employed the judge to adjudicate whether the state actually bugged Garda ombudsman office. The state will never, adjudicate the case itself. So tackling state racism is, and I'll come again, I think it's very important. How do we deal with it?
I think, I'm not saying these things are easy or short term, but I think we have to start with a degree of optimism. Things can change. And the state does what it does because it has the power to do it. The state uses power, whereas the person on the street uses brute force, or the state can use more sophisticated power. But the state, we have got to inform and educate ourselves. Because we have got, and that's why I said this issue about being afraid to speak out. We have got to begin to understand what the government is and what the state is and what the nation is. We are the people. We are the society. We create the government. The government has national, constitutional and international obligations. Human rights obligations. They have signed up to treaties on human rights obligations. It is our responsibility collectively and individually as citizens to hold our government and to hold the power to account. That's what we're here for. If we don't do it, and if we don't collectively find channels to do that, if we don't begin to organise that kind of reclaiming, and there is an organisation in the South called Reclaim the Future. If we don't begin to reclaim the future, we don't have one. So I'm not saying that we can individually, or even, or even that it's safe for a single individual to intervene directly every time they see something racist happening. But you should never let it go by unchallenged in some way. You should never let it. You just shouldn't. You may not immediately be able to intervene at that point, but you should never be witness to an act of racism at any level and go home and feel bad about it. Because if you do, you become complicit in it. You become complicit in the despair. There has to be some way, and you have to find it. Whether that is to report that, and whether that is to go back and say, what did you do about that? Whether that is to identify in the places where you work or live, who is actively undertaking that kind of challenge, and support them in doing it. But we do have at various individual, collective, organisational, social, political structures, we do have mechanisms that we don't use for holding the government to account for its policies, for its practice, for holding the local council to account, for holding ourselves and each other to account. And we have got to rediscover the power of citizenship for the common good. That's why I say, because if we don't, it will sooner or later, no point saying sooner or later it'll be your turn. Your turn has come and gone. And I don't know, I just sit myself and wonder how on earth you allowed the banks to steal your money to the extent you did, and your government survives, and the banks survive, and we haven't even got anybody to say, really, hang on a minute, we don't owe any money. I'm going to finish on this because this is just a very moving away from the intellectual to a very straightforward thing. The banks and the people who up there, if they had lived in Ballymun, if they had been the residents of Ballymun, and they had gone into the chapel, and they had taken the money out of the collection box, and they had gambled it in the bookies, and then they had come back and said, we gambled on the bookies, on money we stole out of the collection box, and I'll tell you what we need you to do now. We need to give you the money we would have won if we hadn't lost the bet. We also need you to put the money back in the collection box because we stole it. Which of you would have said, oh, okay, I get it. You would have run every poor citizen in Ballymun, including the vast majority of them who maybe hadn't even got a bet on the bookie, the people who didn't take it out of it, but you'd have put the whole population of Ballymun in the clink. because they're ordinary people, they're poor people, and in the heads of society, poor people gamble, poor people steal, and poor people expect the government to carry the brunt of it. But the rich gambled, the rich stole, and you paid the bookie, and you paid on the docket. Would you wake up?
I think that ability to say exactly what it means when we talk about racism and sectarianism, and also exactly what it means when we talk about what we might mean when we talk about anti-racism and anti-sectarianism. I think that's extraordinary, Bernadette. Thank you very, very, very much.
My trick now is to get this leg up.
If you're interested, I hope to see some of you, hopefully many of you, at the conference tomorrow. There's some great papers in the Arts Building, IIIS on the 6th floor. And if any of you in the audience are interested in taking the MPhil, we do still have a few places left for next year. And if you are interested, don't hesitate to get in touch with me. I'd be very happy to talk to you. And beyond that, just to say thanks again to Bernadette, thanks to Darrell Jones, thanks to you, the audience, and those who asked questions. Thank you very much.